Infamous is the first game I ever bought for my PS3. I bought a console that didn't come with a game bundled with it, so I needed to choose a game to go along with my shiny new unfeeling monolith that is the PS3 Slim. I had watched a bunch of reviews on the best games for PS3 in preparation for the big day and eventually decided on Infamous. I remember coming home that day, unboxing my PS3 and excitedly inserting the disc, ready to start playing only to be blown away by the opening sequence of the game. That was probably the first time I had ever played a game that started right away without menus or anything, just a straight, "Hey you're in the game now. Get going, stupid." It left a big impression on me and prepared me for what would end up being my favorite, duology in gaming, I guess. It's been a few years since I've last played an Infamous game, and after I finally picked up Infamous Second Son, I decided to replay the first two games before playing it. Oh yeah, and spoilers for the whole game, and some of Infamous too. So the game takes place in Empire City, which is definitely 100% not New York City. Trust me, it's not. Trust me. A giant bomb goes off and you play as Cole McGrath, the guy who detonated the bomb on accident. Cole is a bike courier, and he was delivering a package when the recipient of said package called and told him to open the package, and bada bing, bada boom, it exploded. But it didn't just explode, it also gave Cole superpowers, specifically the ability to harness electricity. So we're basically playing as Electro or Static Shock. A bunch of other stuff happens, and there you go, that's Infamous. Yeah, everybody! The game begins with a shot of a bike leaning against a pole in the bright afternoon sun, and as a kid, when I first played this, I was like, oh, that's nice, it's a nice sunny day, it's beautiful. Then I pressed the start button and BOOM! A giant explosion rocks the screen, sending debris flying everywhere and people running for their lives. Not only did this completely shock me, the first time I played it, but it also works as a way to get the player in the same headspace as Cole. You didn't know that pressing the start button would detonate a bomb, the same way that Cole didn't know that opening the package would detonate the bomb, thus leaving us the player feeling shocked, and a little bit guilty of what we unintentionally did. The same way that Cole is feeling throughout the game. It's a really clever idea. Since the bomb exploded, a strange plague broke out in the city, causing the government to declare a quarantine and block off all routes out of Empire City. Cole has been in a coma since the end of the opening level, and when he finally wakes up, the city's basically gone to hell in a handbasket, and I'm talking like a giant handbasket, like wow, there is so much shit in that handbasket. Cole is accompanied by his best friend Zeke, who is totally not going to betray you despite all the signs pointing to it, Cole's girlfriend Trish, a supposed FBI agent Moya, and the beast himself, John White. And in the villain's corner, we have the three different enemy factions in the game. The Reapers, led by a conduit named Sasha, the Dustmen, led by a conduit named Alden, and the First Sons, led by a conduit named Kessler, who is definitely not Cole from the future. I don't know why would you think that? Now, you might be wondering what I mean when I say conduit. Well, too fucking bad, the game never tells you. At least, the game doesn't tell you in the main story. You have to find a specific audio log to understand what the conduit is. Basically, there's a specific gene that some people have called the conduit gene, and when exposed to a certain type of radiation, in the world of Infamous, it's called Raycevik radiation, they manifest superpowers. So people who have the conduit gene, they're X-Men. They're X-Men. I don't understand why they chose to put the explanation for what a conduit is and what the conduit gene is in a missable audio log, considering how important the idea of a conduit is to the main story. Like the first time I ever played Infamous, the first time I saw the word conduit was when I was fighting the Reaper conduits. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's a new enemy type, alright. And then when you come across the Dustmen, they also have their own conduit, and I was like, oh, I guess they also have a conduit enemy type, despite being completely different from the Reaper one. And then characters in the story start calling people conduits and throwing the word around, and I was like, okay, what the fuck is a conduit? I mean, I eventually put two and two together before I found the audio log that explains it, but you shouldn't put information that is essential to understanding your story in a side objective that is completely optional. That's just not a smart thing to do. A couple other things I have a problem with in terms of the story is that in this game, the plague is supposed to be a result of Sasha's power. She releases a tar-like substance into the water supply of the city and turns people sick, and also puts them under her control with it. And throughout the game, it's only ever referred to as the plague. But in Infamous 2, which takes place in New Marais, which is definitely not New Orleans, there is also a plague, but this is supposed to be the result of Raycevik radiation affecting people without the conduit gene. It doesn't give them superpowers, it just fucking kills them, you know, like real radiation would actually do. However, all the characters in Infamous 2 refer to the plague as if it was the same plague that was in the first Infamous game. So, what's going on here? Are there two different kinds of plagues, but everybody just called both of them the plague without ever distinguishing between the two? Well, yes, actually, that's exactly what happened according to Wikipedia. So I think this is just down to Sucker Punch not thinking that far ahead in terms of planning the story for the sequel, which is also apparent in the way that they chose to wrap up some of the storylines from the first game, because they don't wrap them up, at least not in the game itself. If you finished Infamous, you might be left wondering what happened to a few of the characters, like Sasha, Alden, and Moya. And if you thought you'd get your answers in the second game like I did back in the day, you were wrong. The second game has almost no mention at all of Sasha, Moya, or Alden. The reason for that is because Sucker Punch decided to conclude the story to all those characters in a comic book that was released before the second game came out. I had no idea about this comic book's existence until I started making this video and happened to stumble upon it in the wiki. I don't really like when this kind of thing happens, you know, when a story that was told in a certain medium, such as a movie or video game, gets concluded in a different medium like a comic book or book. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and like I said earlier, I think that Sucker Punch just didn't really think that far enough ahead for the sequel and purposefully left certain story threads untied so they could pick them up again if they wanted to. But that doesn't mean that I have to like it. But yeah, basically Infamous is like a choose-your-own-adventure book about whether or not you want to play as a superhero or a supervillain. It's in the name, you know. Famous. Infamous. They knew what they were fucking doing. The game has a karma system which, depending on your actions and in-game decisions made in certain story moments, will gain you either good or evil karma, which will in turn allow you to get new powers based on your karma level. This system is pretty binary and, to be honest, not very interesting, because you have to pick one side or the other and stick with it the whole game, otherwise you won't get the best powers from either the good or evil side. So it's not really like a Fallout New Vegas idea where you can like become allied with certain factions and people of the wasteland, and the decisions you have to make are pretty gray and morally ambiguous. Infamous is like Pokemon. You can either play the red or blue version, and the majority of the game is the same either way, but you can play the other version to experience the tiny bit of game that you didn't get to experience with the first playthrough. And Pikachu's in both games, they just call him Cole in this one. Infamous is an open world game with 3 different islands making up the game world. You start off in the Neon district of the city, make your way over to the Warren next, and finish the game in the Historic district. Each of the islands have their own distinct feel to them, despite not really being all that different graphically. The graphics in Infamous are not that great, at least at first glance. The draw distance is bad, the textures don't look great, and some of the animations are kinda wonky. But I personally think that the art direction fits the game very well. The city is in a state of disaster. There's a plague that's broken out, infecting hundreds of people. Gangs have taken control of each district in the city. There's garbage, broken windows, and wrecked cars everywhere. Everything is dull and gray, and it really sells the oppressive and hopeless atmosphere that the developers are trying to convey. And seeing the city regain some vitality as you progress through the game, if you play as a hero anyways, is very satisfying. But there is one really bad thing about the technical aspect of the game that can't be ignored, which is the performance. The game aims for 60 frames per second but rarely hits it. In fact, the game is almost constantly dropping frames whether you're running around the city or engaging enemies. It's really noticeable when you first start playing the game, and it honestly shocked me, okay, I'll stop now, to see how bad it was because I had completely forgotten about it. But as the game went on, I got used to it and eventually it stopped bothering me. I don't expect that to be the case for everyone, and I completely understand if it's a deal breaker for you, but it wasn't for me. The gameplay is where it's at with Infamous. Everything about it is just done so well that it's easy to forgive the game's flaws. The controls are really tight and responsive, and Cole's normal movement speed is faster than most other games' sprinting speed. I recently played a few hours of Watch Dogs 2 before replaying Infamous, and the difference in control is staggering. The controls in Watch Dogs 2 feel so sluggish and slow compared to Infamous that it feels like the character is underwater. I'm pretty sure that has to do with the difference in animation style. Infamous is all hand animated while Watch Dogs is motion captured. This allows Cole to just respond instantly to your inputs, whereas the other character, whose name I cannot remember because of how little personality he had, takes a few milliseconds to shift his body weight and positioning to begin moving. And the combat is just as quick and responsive as the movement. At any time in gameplay, Cole can engage in combat. There's a simplistic melee attack system, but most of your fighting will be with Cole's powers. Just press the L1 button and the camera will switch from a wide view of Cole to an over-the-shoulder third-person shooter view. Cole can blast enemies with his basic lightning bolt, he can chuck grenades at them, he can repel them, he can shoot electric rockets at them, and more. Almost every one of his powers comes from the typical arsenal of weapons you'd find in a shooter, i.e. Cole's precision shot is a sniper while the megawatt hammer is an RPG. And you can engage enemies at any point while climbing as well. Whereas in something like Assassin's Creed, you basically just hold a button and press the direction you want to go to climb there, and it's all very contained and controlled. Infamous makes you press a button every time you want to climb higher or lower. You would think that this would become annoying and repetitive, but I don't think it does. It keeps the player engaged and focused on the parkour, where in Assassin's Creed you just sort of tune out until you reach your destination because you don't really have to do anything else. Infamous also has this sort of stickiness to its climbing that I haven't seen in any other open world game. Whenever you jump towards something climbable, Cole will be drawn towards it in a fashion that's sort of like a magnetic pull. The developers said that the system was like reading the player's mind through their thumbs. It doesn't work 100% correctly all of the time. There are some instances where you'll be trying to reach a specific part of a building, probably to pick up a collectible, and you won't be able to grab onto what you're trying to grab onto because the system thinks you're trying to grab the window beside it or the ledge above it. But these are pretty rare, and even though they can be a little bit frustrating, there was never a time where I wasn't able to eventually maneuver myself to the spot I was trying to reach. Eventually, Cole unlocks the ability to grind on things like power lines and railroad tracks, and the static thrusters, which allow him to float for a limited distance, which allows you to get around even faster than before. Kinda like Static Shock. The gameplay is so satisfying because of how responsive and quick it is. You want to get to the top of a building? Start climbing and the sticky system, which is what I'm calling it, will allow you to get to the top in seconds. You want to get from one island to another? Jump across a couple buildings and use your static thrusters to get onto a grind rail and you'll get there in no time. Want to start combat with an enemy? Just start shooting and you'll get your experience points. Infamous's world is perfectly designed for the power and moveset of its player character. The city is a perfect place for a superhero with electrical powers, and the developers capitalize the fuck out of it. There's even a great excuse as to why Cole can't swim, which is always an awkward thing for open world games. He's electrical. He can't go into the water, otherwise his powers will backfire and he'll electrocute himself. Playing this game 10 years after its release, it's honestly astonishing to me how little influence on the open world genre as a whole Infamous seems to have had. Batman Arkham Asylum came out the same year as Infamous and has had a much bigger influence on other games. A bunch of games aped its combat system, or at least took some sort of inspiration from it. Two games that immediately come to mind are Insomniac's Spider-Man and the Middle-earth games. But with Infamous, I can't think of any other game that uses the sticky parkour system or has tried to integrate a character's moveset into the open world design as well as Infamous has. The one thing, though, that honestly annoys me the most about the direction that open world games have gone is the sluggish and unresponsive controls, movement, and combat that seems to be shared across a lot of them. With the aforementioned Watch Dogs games, the Assassin's Creed series, Red Dead Redemption, Grand Theft Auto, and the Middle-earth games, just to name a few. Another thing that open world games have had a tough time dealing with is a sense of progression and pacing. A lot of open world games just don't really have any sense of pacing. You start off in an open world and can explore anything at any time, and there isn't anything necessarily wrong with that, like some of my favorite games are like that, like Fallout 3 or Skyrim. And it really works in those cases, but at the same time, you sort of get the feeling from other open world games that they decided to allow the player to go anywhere from the start of the game, not because it was their intention all along, and more because they couldn't figure out how to do the pacing in an open world game correctly, or they just couldn't be bothered. A lot of Ubisoft open world games come to mind that fit this description for me, but Infamous does not have that problem. Infamous is probably the best paced open world game I have ever played. You start off in a pretty small section of the first island that still has power. Cole is a walking battery, and as such, whenever you use his powers, you need to recharge them from a source of electricity, be it a nearby car or street light or what have you. However, most of the city does not have electricity at the start of the game, meaning that Cole is at a huge disadvantage if he tries to move around in those sections, because not only can he not easily recharge himself, which is also how you heal your health, the screen also becomes fuzzy and hazy because Cole does not function well when he's off the grid. There's also a lot more enemies in areas without power because Cole hasn't been there yet to chase them out, meaning there really isn't any incentive for the player to go to those locations until the power has been restored. Throughout the game, Cole will gradually restore power to every part of the city, and each time he does, he gains a new power. And along the way, the game is constantly drip-feeding you new enemy types to fight. So the game's pacing is like this. You begin with Cole's basic power set in a small part of the city with the most basic gun-wielding enemies. Each time you turn on the power to that part of the city, you gain a new power to add to your arsenal. You have a new section of city to explore, and you've also encountered probably 1 or 2 new enemy types along the way. And this cycle continues through the whole game, meaning there is always a new power to try out, a new enemy to fight, and a new chunk of city to explore. It's superbly done. Another thing that Infamous does better than other open world games are the side missions. In a lot of open world games, the only reason to do side missions are to either get experience points for upgrades, money to buy shit, or both. Now you do get experience points for completing side missions in Infamous for upgrades, but you also get another gameplay and narrative incentive as well. See, whenever you complete a side mission, that means that you've cleaned up that part of the city, meaning that people will begin repairing storefronts and cleaning up garbage and basically trying to reclaim their city from the gangs that have taken control of it. Also, enemies will no longer spawn in places that you've cleaned up, meaning that you can run around that part of the city without worrying about being jumped by a bunch of enemies. At least they won't spawn nearly as often, and in smaller numbers than they used to, because even when running around a completely cleaned up city, I still encountered the rare enemy every so often. So yeah, Infamous is pretty damn great, I think. It almost feels like it's become a forgotten gem though, because when people talk about some of the best games of last generation, and specifically PlayStation 3, neither Infamous 1 or 2 ever seem to come up, which is bizarre to me. Because looking at the review scores, a lot of people seem to like it. It got pretty decent scores and there weren't that many people who didn't like it, but there is one strange criticism that I ran into a couple times that just seems weird to me. Some reviewers genuinely considered the voice of Cole to be a detriment to the game. They don't even say that his voice acting was bad, because it isn't. They just say that they don't like the voice. I hope that isn't the reason that Sucker Punch chose to change the voice actor for Cole for the second game, but I don't know. With the really popular trend of releasing remasters of games from last gen, like The Last of Us Remastered and the Uncharted collection, I am shocked, gotta get a last one in, that there hasn't been an Infamous collection type thing for the PS4. I think that Infamous really got the shaft in the long run, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. So that's it. That's the review. To sum up, if you've never played Infamous, I would recommend playing it, especially if you like open world games, because Infamous does the whole open world thing better than most modern open world games do. It still holds up 10 years later. I'm gonna give Infamous an 8.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching the video. It's a little different than my other game reviews. I decided to drop the super in-depth analytical thing, at least for now, to just try something out, try something different, something that's a little bit more me, and I think it turned out all right. Let me know what you think. If you want, leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe, give me your house, give me your firstborn if you want. All right, thanks.